Well, let's have a look here at the BBC. What is it? The 26th of September 2014. Dave Lee Travis given suspended sentence. DJ Travis guilty of indecent assault. Former BBC Radio 1 DJ Dave Lee Travis has been given a suspended sentence of 3 months for indecently assaulting a woman in 1995. Let's read further. The 69-year-old had been found guilty of attacking a researcher who was working on TV's Mrs. Merton show. Judge Anthony Leonard told Travis it was an intentional and unpleasant sexual assault. Just reading the points that are interesting to us. Travis, a former Top of the Pops presenter, cornered the woman in the corridor of a television studio where she was smoking and commented on her, in inverted commas, poor little lungs, before squeezing her breast for 10 to 15 seconds. So he commented on her poor little lungs before squeezing her breast for 10 to 15 seconds. 10 to 15 seconds. You took advantage of a young woman in a vulnerable position. Young. She was young. She was young. Judge Anthony Leonard. That's what Judge Anthony Leonard said. Yes, he said you took advantage of a young woman in a vulnerable position. That's interesting, because I'm going to talk about male genital mutilation and how I was taken advantage of, and I was very, very young, wasn't I? In a victim impact statement which was read out at London's Southwark Crown Court ahead of his sentencing, the victim said, "I was a naive and trusting 22-year-old when I was subjected to an unprovoked and terrifying physical assault at my place of work. So having her breasts groped for, 10 to 15 seconds was a terrifying physical assault. I was too paralyzed with fear to confront my assailant. So apparently she was too paralyzed to even speak up for herself assertively." But to continue, the woman said she felt lucky that she was physically resilient enough to get on with her life, thanks largely to my colleagues. So she's been able to put it behind her, apparently. She said the process of remembering the incident still took her back to feeling like a scared, vulnerable young woman. Young woman, yes, she was young. 22-year-old. "Being forced to recall the evidence in court has been painful," she said. "That's like having a flashback, isn't it, really? It is. It's painful to remember." The judge and society would seem to think that it's, reasonable that a person can have flashbacks and an unpleasant time after an unwanted sexual grope like that. We know with the recent Rolf Harris case, that even a very short and digital penetration is enough to give a person flashbacks and ongoing mental problems that will last for years and years, ostensibly. And imagine what this girl has to go through with her 10 to 15 seconds of groping, how traumatic it must have been for her psychologically and physically, yes. Vulnerable victim, Judge Leonard, who suspended Travis's sentence for 2 years, said it was an intentional and unpleasant sexual assault. "You took advantage of a young woman in a vulnerable position whose job it was to look after you that day. She was vulnerable, and she was young, wasn't she?" Yes, she was. And that's all the bits that I wanted to read. But let's just have a quick look over some of those points again. Yes, so he squeezed her breasts for 10 to 15 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 15 seconds it went on for. That was quite a while, wasn't it? And yes, well, I was genitally mutilated as a small child, a newborn child. And I was very, very young, and it went on for more than 15 seconds. I was in a vulnerable position. Indeed, I was strapped down, wasn't I? I was. Yes. I was a naive and trusting 22-year-old, she said. I was subjected to an unprovoked and terrifying physical assault at my place of work. Well, I was at my place of birth, and I was subjected to an unprovoked and terrifying physical assault too. And you know what I did? I screamed my lungs out. I screamed and screamed and screamed. But this woman said I was too paralyzed with fear to confront my assailant. She was too paralyzed with fear. Well, that's very unfortunate, isn't it? She was paralyzed with fear. I was fearful too when I was being genitally mutilated, but I screamed and screamed and screamed and screamed and screamed, and I didn't stop screaming. She was physically resilient enough to get on with her life, thanks largely to her colleagues. Well, I had no encouragement no one said apologise to me about my genital mutilation. Male genital mutilation that I underwent. Nobody cared. They just did it to me. The process of remembering the incident still took her back to feeling like a scared, vulnerable young woman. She was vulnerable and she was young. I was young and I was vulnerable. I'm just making a comparison here between what this woman went through, the terrible ordeal she went through of having her breasts groped for 10 to 15 seconds, and just comparing it to my terrible experience of male genital mutilation. Being forced to recall the evidence in court has been painful, she said. How painful it must have been for her to recall that event, yes. What a terrible ordeal she went through, especially when you compare it to male genital mutilation. What has happened to this woman is a sex crime, isn't it? She was a vulnerable victim. It's a sex crime. She was subjected to a sex crime. It was an intentional and unpleasant sexual assault. It was a sexual assault, and the sex crime squad was called out, obviously. She was taken advantage of, and she was vulnerable. And it was a terrible, terrible thing to have happened. And my genital mutilation wasn't a sex crime, was it? No. I had my genitals mutilated. I was left with skin bridging for my entire life. And I lost 75 to 80% of the most sensitive nervous tissue on my penis for life, didn't I? And it wasn't a sex crime, so I just wanted to compare the experience of this woman with mine, because I was sexually assaulted too, but no one considers it to be a sexual assault. They don't. What do you think? Do you think that genital mutilation of a boy is a sex crime? I do. I really do. I do.